Hi there. My name's Rima McCoy McDeed. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm going to do a brief visual description of myself for folks that are listening along. I'm a Black woman, light complexion. I'm wearing tortoiseshell glasses. I have large, natural brown hair. I'm wearing a white top, and I'm seated in my home office. And behind me are various pieces of artwork. I am asking for about 25 minutes of your time. And to be really specific, I'm asking Black folks for 25 minutes of your time. I want to introduce a conversation about a piece of legislation that's currently active at the federal level. And it's, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of legislation that's active right now. And outside of a very small population is not being talked about. I want to bring it to the Black community in the US, and I'm doing it via this video. And so I'm going to get a PowerPoint going, and I am cognizant of the fact that PowerPoints aren't necessarily the most exciting thing to look at, but again, 25 minutes of your time, and just stay with me, because this is a conversation that needs to be had, and the conversation is about Medicaid. I want to talk about how making it portable, making it transferable from state to state will lead to universal health care. I want to talk about why systemic anti-Blackness is keeping this from happening and what we can do about it. So, if you don't know who the heck I am, my name's Rima, and I am the executive director of a national disability nonprofit, a national disability-led nonprofit, to be specific. That's important. I'll talk about that here in a few minutes. I'm also a fellow in Ibram Kendi's anti-bigotry convening at Boston University. In addition to my day job, I also facilitate trainings on implicit bias, privilege, and disability diversity and intersectionality all over the country, both in disability-led spaces and outside of disability-led spaces. If you don't know what a disability-led space is, I'm going to be talking about that as well. A few years ago, I got AT&T Humanity of Connection Award with regards to the work that I do pertaining to racial equity and disability spaces. I'm also a member of the disability community. I'm the first openly autistic person to run for state legislature in US history. I didn't win. Could have a whole other separate conversation about systemic racism in the political landscape, but that's a video for another time. We're talking Medicaid today. All right. So I want to touch on a variety of things in a very short period of time right now. I want to talk about what Derma is. It's a bill that would make Medicaid portable after disaster strikes. And I want us to gain a situational awareness of the unique needs of Black folks, disabled and otherwise, before, during, and after disasters. I want to talk about how white supremacy informs how the disability-led community, and again, I'll talk about what the disability-led community is in a moment, but how it approaches systems advocacy around legislation like Derma. Black folks need to know about this, very pertinent. And I also want to identify simple yet profound actions that non-Black people can take to shift the systems advocacy paradigm as it pertains to Derma and also in general. I'm cognizant of the fact that non-Black people are going to be watching this video as well. You are welcome to do so, but this is a conversation that is geared towards Black folks specifically. All right, so without further ado, what is Derma? What does it have to do with Medicaid? Derma stands for Disaster Relief Medicaid Act, DRMA. It was introduced by Senator Bob Casey out of Pennsylvania and Congressman Jimmy Panetta out of California in August of 2021. So the gist of Derma is this: People are often forced to leave their homes during disasters, and sometimes people need to leave their state. We've seen this very recently with Hurricane Ida. Hurricane Ida happened on the 16th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, which was cataclysmic for the Black community in New Orleans. If a person receives healthcare or home and community-based services through Medicaid, moving to another state typically means that they lose those benefits. Medicaid stays in the state that the person is a resident in. If a person has to leave the state as a result of being impacted by a disaster, they lose their Medicaid, they lose their health care. Derma has been introduced to bridge that gap, so to speak. Derma would establish a new category for Medicaid eligible people from disaster areas. They would be known as relief eligible survivors. Derma would help relief eligible survivors to keep their Medicaid services if they have to move out of state as a result of being impacted by a disaster. It would create a simpler process for relief eligible survivors to apply for and be approved for Medicaid services. It would provide assistance and funding to states to support the needs of relief eligible survivors. And it would also implement a grant to help states create an emergency response corps to provide home and community-based services to relief eligible survivors. This would be especially important for folks that are disabled and folks that are aging. So think about disabled Black folks who are elders, and folks that are Black, disabled, and aging all at the same time. What is READY? READY stands for Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters Act. And READY would create training and technical assistance centers all over the US that would be staffed by people with disabilities, by disabled people, who would be providing kind of subject matter expertise specific to the disability community, with regard to emergency preparedness and disaster recovery issues. Now, why am I talking about READY? Because Derma is paired with READY. These bills were both introduced in August of 2021 in tandem. The lawmakers that introduced Derma did not think that it would be viable on its own. READY is seen as being more palatable. That's what we need to talk about right now. But before we get to that, because there's systemic stuff there, why should Derma be a big deal to Black folks? So, gaps in existing basic services like transportation systems, housing, and healthcare options make it even harder for Black people to get to safety when disaster strikes. Restrictions in service systems, including asset limits and public programs and caps on prescription drugs, mean that Black people are prevented from adequately preparing in advance of disasters. Communities where we live are particularly vulnerable to all kinds of disasters because we live in places typically where disasters are more likely to strike. And the things that keep people safe are less reliable and less well maintained in the places where we live. Inequalities in communities where people must evacuate to escape disasters often leave Black people behind. Black people are more likely to die or sustain a critical injury during disaster than white people. And the disproportionate death and injury rates are not inevitable, of course. We're talking about systemic stuff here. They are the direct result of the discrimination and exclusion Black people face in disaster and emergency planning systems and processes. And because the disability-led community has been tasked with advocating for Derma by the lawmakers that introduced it in tandem with READY, efforts to engage in systems advocacy regarding this issue are thwarted by racism. Anti-Blackness, specifically, in spite of the fact that Black people are the ones most impacted when disaster strikes. So, when systems advocacy and implicit bias collide, and I'm going to get to what the disability-led community is. So, but before that, want to make sure that we're operating from the same definition when I discuss implicit bias. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're defining it as attitudes and or stereotypes that impact our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And so when we're talking about what something like implicit bias is, it's helpful to talk about what it isn't so that folks aren't trying to skirt around what can be a challenging conversation for them to grapple with. Implicit bias is not the KKK burning a cross in a Black person's front yard, not calling a Black person the N-word. It's not racial profiling. These are overt manifestations of racism. Implicit bias, when we're talking about race, is more about the covert manifestations of racism. Here are some examples. Quietly rushing, if you're a white person, to hide your purse in your desk when a Black male in a delivery uniform walks past, even if his hands are full of packages. You are sitting, you white person sitting, engaged in a phone call at your desk without giving a second thought. You sense that the Black man is approaching, you grab your purse, you throw it in your desk drawer, you don't give it a second thought. That Black man is acutely aware of absolutely everything that you've just done because his sustainability is contingent on him having a hyper awareness of what's going on around him and how people are responding to his presence. If he lets that go for a moment, that's when police get called. That's when white people do things out of fear that lead to Black people dying. Experiencing anxiety when a Black person in your proximity is not smiling. Simplifying your language when speaking with Black people. Assuming that Black people are either victims or statistics or support persons with regard to systems advocacy, and certainly not decision makers or leaders. So thanks to implicit bias, the default setting in the United States is white, middle class, male, female, binary. We can add a whole bunch of other things here, Christian, et cetera, straight, presenting. So finally, what is the disability-led community? So the disability-led community is comprised of folks that are disabled, like myself, who advocate for and provide services to disabled people. So I identify as a member of the disability-led community. This video is me intentionally stepping away from the disability community to connect with the Black community. The disability-led rights movement came into being in response to disabled people feeling that our needs were not being adequately addressed or even prioritized or taken seriously by the non-disabled people in our lives. So that sounds like kumbaya or utopia, right? So let's talk about Derma and the disability-led community. So systems advocacy, again, for Derma has been done in tandem with READY. The lawmakers that introduced Derma and READY have specifically asked the disability-led community to mobilize the disability-led community around advocacy for Derma and READY. And lawmakers are much more amenable to READY than they are to Derma because they tend to shy away from anything related to Medicaid. This includes Democrat lawmakers. This includes moderate Democrat lawmakers. This includes progressive Democrat lawmakers. Medicaid makes lawmakers uncomfortable. And that's why Derma is tagging along with READY for the ride, so to speak. Why? Well, proportionally speaking, 3 times as many Black people in this country use Medicaid as white people. And wherever there are white people, including in the disability-led community, there is racism. What does white supremacy look like in the disability-led community? The decision makers are white. The space, the community as we know it, incorporated by white people. The most notable people in the disability-led community are white. White people decide what difficult conversations will be breached and how they will be breached in the disability-led community. White people have the final say regarding what systems advocacy looks like in the disability-led community, including who participates in that systems advocacy. Black people, other people of color do not independently decide systems advocacy opportunities in the disability-led community without white people signing off on that. People who have brown or black skin, who are present in the disability-led community, are there because they are receiving services and supports at a center for independent living or something like that, are providing direct services and supports as a frontline caregiver, or have been assigned a task by a white person pertaining to systems advocacy. If we're talking about the latter, then the case is usually that the black or brown person is being showcased as a statistic, as a victim, or they are directed to reiterate points made by white people, typically at the end of a presentation, panel, or action. White people lead, white disabled people lead systems advocacy efforts on behalf of the disability-led community. And this includes determining how or if Black people participate. That's white supremacy in action. I call it wheelchair accessible white supremacy, and it kills systems advocacy. And with regard to Derma, a bill that could be so impactful outside of the disability-led community, with regard to the Black community in particular, I take that very seriously. And so the irony is this: the people most impacted by disaster in the disability-led community, Black people, Black disabled people, are systematically robbed of the mic when it's time for the disability-led community to do systems advocacy. That's why I've created this video. It's time to take Derma out of conversations specific to the disability-led community and bring in a larger audience. More irony: the disability-led community came into existence because disabled people felt that they were being robbed of opportunities to speak on their own behalf, which is exactly how disabled Black people feel about our experience in the disability-led community today. Who inspired the disability-led rights movement? Brown versus Board of Education, Civil Rights Act, two pivotal pieces of legislation for the Black civil rights movement. These inspired the disability-led rights movement, which leads us to the greatest irony of them all. The disability-led rights movement was inspired by the Black civil rights movement. And once it gained momentum, it began to systematically exclude and or erase the very people that inspired its movement, which is Black people. And so when we're talking about rights, civil rights, disability rights, whatever, there's some unpacking to do around the term rights in the first place. And the fact of the matter is, as great as rights are, they often have insufficient mechanisms for actual enforcement and accountability ultimately. And then there are the David and Goliath type dynamics that exist between advocates, activists, and lobbyists in the eyes of legislators. And then they typically only benefit the most privileged members of the marginalized community that they're meant to protect. I'm going to dive into that here in a moment, because ultimately rights are about parallels, not intersections. So to dive into this, rights are about creating space for populations of people in a society that wasn't built for them in the first place. And people with power have the privilege to decide whether to extend or withhold rights from people with little to no power. And if the powers that be decide to extend rights, it's usually the most privileged of the marginalized that benefit, and usually use these benefits to assume the role of powers that be. So we see this in marginalized communities in the US. You look at women, you look at the LGBTQ plus community, you look at the disability community. People who are in decision-making roles in those communities, as diverse as those communities are white people. So what I'm talking about as far as the disability-led community and how it interfaces with white supremacy, you see the same dynamic in the queer community. You see the same dynamic certainly in with women. And this is how white supremacy evolves and prevails in marginalized spaces like the disability-led community. And so the more removed a person is from default setting in the US, the more likely they are to end up incarcerated, homeless, institutionalized, impacted by disasters, acquiring a disability through a traumatic event, ostracized from family or community, silenced, and or otherwise occupying the fringes of mainstream society. So some quick statistics that kind of illuminate what happens to marginalized people in this country. In the US, 13.4% of us are Black. In the US, 38.2% of folks who experience incarceration are Black. 40% of people who experience homelessness in this country are Black. And 8.2% of people who experience unemployment in this country are Black. And so we see that the marginalization of race, how it plays out for the Black community. This is just a few of several different ways that happens. So the more removed a person is from the default setting, the less likely that they will be allowed to participate in systems advocacy in any other capacity besides statistic, victim, talking point, and or token. And this is why systems advocacy fails so often in the disability-led community. And with regard to Derma, this is pertinent to the Black community as well. Because when systems advocacy fails, Black people die. And so let's talk specifically about why systems advocacy fails in disability-led spaces. Advocates in disability-led spaces, more often than not, are not directly impacted by the issue they are advocating for. Because in spite of the marginalization they personally experience, they still have access to privilege that buffers them from a lot of the issues that they advocate for. Disability-led spaces tend to be very insular to the point of being hostile to outsiders. And this can create an echo chamber of what I've, again, referred to as wheelchair accessible white supremacy. And that can skew the disability-led community's understanding of issues and imperatives. And then there's the unchecked privilege. I can't oppress people because I'm an oppressed person. I'm a person with a disability. And even though I'm white, that means that there's no way that I can oppress Black people. That's not true. And then there's the expectation that Black people be grateful for the opportunity to operate in a way that preserves the status quo as victims and tokens. And so how does this play into Derma? Because white people are dominating systems advocacy, white disabled people are dominating systems advocacy around Derma. They are determining how Derma is discussed right as we speak, literally right now. And because Derma is specific to Medicaid, and Medicaid tends to be stigmatized because it is used by Black people, again, at 3 times the rate of white people, white disabled Derma and Ready advocates have decided to downplay this legislation and focus on Ready. I have attended systems advocacy events regarding Derma and Ready where Derma is not even mentioned. Ready, which is mentioned and which is focused on as far as these 2 pieces of legislation are concerned, like most federally funded disability programs, will primarily benefit white disabled people. So Medicaid optics by race. When we think about Black people accessing Medicaid, we think welfare queens, people who are lazy, people who are mooching off of society. But when we think about Medicaid beneficiaries in the context of white people, we think vulnerable citizens who deserve support. And this is a big reason why the white disability-led community has been tasked with advocating for Derma, because it's the optics are seen as white disabled people are more deserving of Medicaid than the Black community is. Why Black people need to reclaim Derma. Again, Black folks use Medicaid at 3 times the rate of white people because of systemic inequity, obviously. Black people flat out need Medicaid. I speak as a person who's a former Medicaid beneficiary. And when I was on Medicaid and my child was on Medicaid, I was working full time in a management capacity, but my income level was still low enough that I qualified for Medicaid. Black people, disabled or otherwise, are displaced by disaster far more than any other population. And Derma would allow for Medicaid to follow Black people, as well as all other Medicaid beneficiaries, whenever there's a need to move after disaster strikes. The portability of Medicaid, the ability to take Medicaid with us in the instance of disaster, this is a step in the right direction as far as conversations pertaining to universal health care are concerned. And I should mention, the views and opinions that I am expressing right now are my own. This is my own opinion, but nevertheless, that's where I stand as far as this is concerned. You know, this is a way to gain momentum as far as conversations pertaining to universal health care are concerned. And so for those of you that are listening that aren't Black, who are wondering, well, what can I do to be proactive in all of this? You can do some very simple but powerful things. Lawmakers need to hear from people most impacted by an issue. Pass the mic. It's as simple as that. If you are presented with an opportunity to advocate for an issue, you aren't personally impacted by the issue, but you're passionate about it, find somebody that is impacted by it, pass the mic to them. Please recognize that tokenism or inclusion via statistical reference of people most impacted by an issue will only perpetuate inequity and objectification of that population. When you hear white and non-Black people speaking negatively about a Black person in advocacy spaces, 10 times out of 10, it's because that Black person is confronting anti-Blackness within that space, and those white and non-Black people, and to be fair, on occasion, you'll get a few Black folks too, feel threatened by that. Please believe Black people, especially if that Black person is not speaking on behalf of the status quo. Believe Black people. Use your status as a white or non-disabled or non-Black person to speak up when you don't see Black people leading systems advocacy efforts, Black disabled people, including and especially efforts around Derma. Pay attention to the Black people who are participating. Are they secondary figures to their white colleagues who are driving the conversation? Ask questions about that without veering out of your lane and without creating an unsafe situation for the Black folks present. Why am I doing this presentation? Because Black people need to know about Derma, period. Because wheelchair accessible white supremacy, it has shut out Black people out of opportunities to, independent of invitations and quote unquote direction of white people, lead conversations about Derma in disability-led spaces. This conversation needs to happen outside of the silo of disability-led spaces as it is currently in order for Derma to be viable. Black people deserve better, period. Please contact your US senators, contact your congresspeople. Please share this video. This conversation needs to be kept going. Again, this legislation is some of the most important legislation that's active at the federal level right now. And nobody's talking about it outside of disability-led spaces. Please do what you can to signal boost this conversation. If it's not sharing this video, if you don't like me as a person, that's fine. Tons of people don't. I don't care about that. I care about this conversation developing legs underneath it and getting out into the community. So please do what you are moved to do to keep this conversation going. Any questions, comments, points of clarification, please visit my website, www.rema.org, R-E-Y, M as in Mary.org. I thank you for your time. Again, do what you can to share this conversation. Let's get Medicaid portable. It's a step in the right direction as far as universal health care is concerned. Thank you.